The Kalb Report is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and our subject tonight, all the news that's fit to print, behind the scenes at the New York Times. I don't know about you, but I am grateful for three things every day. One, that I get up in the morning. Two, that I live in a free country. And three, that copies of two newspapers are dropped off in front of my house every day, 7 days a week. More reliable, I've found, than the United States Postal Service. For me, the newspaper is a morning miracle. Imagine stories from all over the world, all over the country, science, sports, medicine, economics, finance, truly a morning miracle essential to the functioning of an open and free society. One of my morning newspapers is the New York Times, arguably the most respected newspaper in the United States and certainly one of the best in the world. We are delighted to welcome Executive Editor Bill Keller and Washington Bureau Chief Dean Baquet to the National Press Club and to the Kalb Report. Bill Keller has been executive editor since 2003, and he has been with the paper since 1984, been a reporter since 1970. He's been bureau chief in the Soviet Union and South Africa. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the Soviet Union, and he's also been a columnist and managing editor of the paper. Dean Baquet has been with the Times since 1990, though he did take 7 years off to be managing editor and editor of the Los Angeles Times. He quit the LA Times when he refused a corporate order to fire more journalists. He, too, has won a Pulitzer Prize. Okay, Bill and Dean, I've called your newspaper a morning miracle, and I mean it. I'm always amazed at what I can find in the newspaper. So how do you make a miracle? And Bill, I want to start with you with a couple of basic questions and sort of get the lay of the land. You work in New York, which is the headquarters of the New York Times. How many people work for the Times?
Well, for the newsroom, not counting everything from the delivery trucks to the advertising department, and actual journalists, it's a little more than 1,100.
1,100.
That includes reporters, editors, photographers, videographers, web producers, a whole panoply of clerks. But about 1,100, 1,150.
But of the 1,100, how many are actually reporters who go out to cover stories?
Roughly 400.
Roughly 400 of the 1,100. And on a normal day, when do you get in?
I usually get in about 8:30.
About 8:30. And when is your first meeting? Who attends, and why do you have it?
Well, we've just changed our first meeting, which for many years began at 10:30 and was mostly focused on sort of getting ready for the next day's printed paper. We now start at 10 o'clock, and we devote our time pretty much equally to things that we're thinking about for the printed newspaper and things that we're thinking about for the homepage of the website. And so that's a meeting where we really look at what are the stories, the actual running news stories first and foremost, how we're going to approach them, whether other editors at the table have thoughts on things that they could bring to it.
Who are the other editors who are there?
The heads of all of the various news departments, the Metro desk, the National desk, the Foreign desk, the Business desk, Culture, Science, and so on.
How many, about a dozen?
Yeah, about a dozen. It ebbs and flows. You know, for a while we didn't have an environment desk. That was done under the National desk. Now we do have an environment desk, and that editor comes. Likewise, we have a media editor. It used to be under the business report, but is now more independent. So it fluctuates. People come, the head of the video unit comes, the head of graphics comes, the head of photography comes. And particularly when we're talking about the website, we want to hear from them what they've got planned to sort of keep the website feeling fresh and current through the day.
How many other meetings, formal meetings, aside from just bumping into somebody in the hallway, do you have in the course of a day?
Well, there are two main meetings, that morning meeting, and then there's a 4 o'clock meeting where we pick the stories that are going to go on the front page the next day, and now also talk about what's going to be on the homepage of the website first thing in the morning. Those are the two meetings that the day is kind of built around, that all the key players come to. I've got a lot of other meetings that I go to, but those are the ones that really affect the journalism.
And Dean, you're representing the Washington Bureau. Are you part of all of these meetings too?
Sure.
The two big ones?
Yeah, we're on the Bureau is on the phone for the meetings. We're on a speakerphone participating in the meeting. And essentially, just to amplify a little bit about what Bill described, each desk describes what it thinks are its best stories of the day for the home page and for the front page of the print paper. And you sort of start the process of making a pitch for why you think your story should get the best play. So it's the beginning of a competition of the day, too.
I see. And what do you think is your major responsibility representing Washington?
I think my major responsibility is to sift through the sort of mix of real news of the day, faux news of the day, if you will, and try to give Bill a sense of the 2 or 3 really significant stories of the day in Washington.
And how many reporters work for you in Washington?
There are a total of about 45 people in the Bureau, counting reporters, editors, and others. And I guess probably about 28, 29 of them are reporters.
Would that make it the largest bureau outside of New York?
Yes, yes. Yep.
Bill, when in the course of a day do you yourself have a sharp feel for what it is that's going to be the New York Times the next day?
It depends. I mean, on a week when there's, just major breaking news, when a country is in turmoil, or you have a State of the Union address, or some major event that you're watching very closely, you kind of know early on in the day, and it's what are the other pieces that you're thinking about. In a slow news period, I may not know until the page 1 meeting at 4 o'clock, and sometimes considerably later than that. We'll still be looking around for something that's substantive enough. It's more an art than a science, putting together the stories for the front page. But you want, first and foremost, you want the page to feel sort of urgent and in the flow of events, not to seem sort of optional or lightweight.
But at the same time, there are days when the New York Times does not have a hard lead for the newspaper, and you're now prepared to go with something that would used to in the old days be described as a feature story. Mm-hmm. Why do you do that?
As a rule, I would rather put some piece of enterprising reporting there's not breaking news, but something we've discovered. I'd rather put that at the top of the front page than some kind of incremental development in a running story that people will look at and say, so what? It's tempting to do that. I mean, Dean can tell you that Washington is a place where it's particularly tempting because, a piece of legislation passes a subcommittee, and then it passes a committee, and then it goes to the House, and then it goes to the Senate, and then it goes, et cetera. And you can take each of those moments as an occasion to write a big front page story. But nothing much happened between step 1 and step 2 and step 3. So we generally try to relegate the more incremental news to inside stories and put the stuff out front that feels more momentous. Even if it's not an actual event that happened, but something that we just ran across in the course of our reporting.
Right. I remember about 20 years ago, so I did some research at the Shorenstein Center on the front page of the New York Times and went back 30 years ago, then 20, then 10, and then 5, and last year. And what I found was that you used to run many more stories on the front page. You used to run many more hard news stories on the front page. You ran many fewer photographs on the front page, and they were generally small. Mm-hmm. So the front page of the New York Times today is quite different from what it was 15, 20 years ago. Why the change?
Well, it's partly that it looks, in the days when they would put 12 or 14 stories on the front page. Most of them really didn't belong on the front page. It was just the day when the newspaper was regarded as a sort of pastiche of lots of little or not so little things that were going on. And you know, even the slogan, "All the news that fits to print," I think harkens back to a day when you were when the aim of the newspaper was to be comprehensive. We're going to tell you maybe only a little bit, but a little bit about everything. And I think, you know, that slogan maybe describes an aspiration or a kind of mindset, but now we tend to be more selective, but try to give you more depth, to tell you the stories that are not obvious, that are not, you know, in the days that you're talking about, they used to put the comings and goings of ships in the New York harbor on the front page. There aren't that many ships coming and going in the New York harbor anymore, and mostly they don't matter all that much to your average reader.
But you talk about all the news that's fit to print, and you say that there was a time when the Times was a comprehensive newspaper. Are you saying that it isn't now?
Yeah, I don't think there's any such thing as a comprehensive
Well, how would you
newspaper
describe
anymore.
the Times today, then?
I think we try to tell you what you need to know to be a well-informed citizen across the board. But that doesn't mean that every minor incremental development in a piece of legislation, that every inconclusive lawsuit, that everything that, you know, that is news at some level is important enough to be in the New York
I accept
Times.
that, but why then so many feature stories when there are, in fact, hard news stories that you could put on the front page?
What have you got against feature stories?
I am.
Some of my favorite stories are feature stories.
I am of the sort who believes that the newspaper, as it gets smaller, which is the Times' fate in recent years, as it is the fate of other newspapers too, nothing distinctive about the Times, because you don't have that much more room now, you ought to level with the reader and give us the hard news of the day. Do you really have the time to do the feature stuff?
Evidently, because we do a lot of
I
it.
know, but should you?
Well, you know, there are a lot of hard news stories that really do not justify the space. And there are a lot of feature stories that actually tell you quite a bit about, I mean, when you say feature stories, it's an umbrella that covers a lot of different things.
Yes.
It covers profiles of interesting people in the news that you want to understand because they're actors. It may include snapshots of life in a community that's affected by the economy or by some upheaval overseas. Those are features, but they carry the values of the news. They help you understand what's going on in the world in the same way that, you know, the news of some foreign official's speech or a cabinet member's ribbon cutting would tell you.
Okay.
Can I
No, please
toss
do.
in? I mean, I would make I would back what Bill said, but I would do it.
That is not surprising.
But I would
You
say.
don't know Dean.
But I would say something provocative. Newspapers were never comprehensive. I think the sort of grand image of the comprehensive newspaper 30, 40 years ago, they were sort of a little bit fake comprehensive. I think if you sat down with the editors, which I have, who ran papers during that era, they would tell you the New York Times and the Washington Post fronted the British Prime Minister's speech, but missed the rise of whole other parts of the world that were much, much more significant. They might have fronted the fourth movement of a bill from a House subcommittee to another committee, but they missed until very late, the dramatic shifts in the way women interacted in the workplace. I would argue that had newspapers had the sensibility they have now, those would have been covered. And they were much more significant than the announcement of the British Prime Minister's budget. And I would also argue that those probably would have been crafted as so-called feature stories, but they would have captured something much, much more significant at the time.
That is entirely possible, but what you're describing are the changes in American society.
Right.
The idea that we did not focus in the news business on women, children, health, is simply a fact. But that does not change the point about whether you're dealing with hard news or whether you're making an effort at presenting what Bill was saying, which is give the reader what that reader should know on any given day about the world.
But I would counter, I guess I would counter, as somebody who worked at papers during some of that period, but also somebody who's looked back at papers, that is hard news. I mean, if you ask Gene Roberts, who is one of the legendary newspapers editors at the New York Times, and he also ran the Inquirer. Gene Roberts was the national editor of the New York Times, and before that he was a correspondent in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. If you ask Gene Roberts what are the biggest stories that he missed as a journalist, which I have, none of them would have been the kinds of stories that people would traditionally characterize as hard news. He would describe them as shifts in the South. He would describe them as the biggest stories that newspapers missed while they were focusing on incremental news as being the kinds of stuff, you know, the movement of blacks from the South to the North, the changes in the workplace, the events that led up so that the country wouldn't have been so stunned by Kent State.
No, Dean, I have no argument at all with everything that you've said. But every single one of those would have been, every single one of those could have been and probably would have been a hard news story. If 50,000 blacks moved from a small town in the South up to Detroit, when they got to Detroit and the effect it had on Detroit, that was a news story.
But it didn't happen that way. It didn't happen as an event the way newspapers had been trained to cover. It didn't happen on Monday. It sort of oozed over years.
Okay. Dean's really put his finger on something important. When people talk about hard news, they tend to mean events. The president did something today. Something concrete happened. There was an accident, a disaster of some sort. That's what people generally talk about when they mean hard news. But that doesn't cover a whole realm of enterprise investigative news that is not lying out there to be harvested easily by reporters. It requires time and digging, but I'm sure you would agree, is some of the most worthwhile journalism we do.
Absolutely, I do. I completely agree. Moving right on. What is your competition today?
That's a really good question. It's something that we ask ourselves
I mean,
a lot.
Is it the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal? Is
Yes
it
and
the
no.
Wild Web? What is it?
It is all of the above in different ways. I mean, you know, I still look at newspapers and newspaper websites, but even that category has extended beyond the sort of immediate people who compete with us for circulation on the ground in the U.S. I read the British websites, for example. From there, I read the BBC, I read The Guardian, I look at the Telegraph sometimes. The Washington Post is still a competitor. The Wall Street Journal is very much a competitor because, like the Times, it's a national newspaper, not a regional newspaper. But you know, I look at all of those other places too. I look at Politico, I look at the Huffington Post, I look at the Daily Beast, and so on. Or somebody looks at them and tells me because I can't spend the whole day looking at what
I understand,
other people
but what then, at the end of that day, is your feeling about the major competition? What would bother you the most if a Web had a story you didn't have or the Wall Street Journal did?
By a very surprisingly small margin, the Wall Street Journal. Once upon a time, it would have been a larger margin. Okay. Now, I don't like to get beaten by anybody, and the fact that somebody beats us on a substantial website means that it's going to be all over the place. So, I regard them all as competitors. And by the way, not just for the stories. They're competing. Politico, Huffington Post, and places like that are competing with us for talent. They're actually hiring people.
Yes.
They're competing with us in the field of innovation. I don't regard the Huffington Post as a particularly aggressive competitor on coverage of international affairs, but the way they use social media is pretty instructive, and we watch that.
We're describing and we're talking about a very competitive world in journalism today. Does this competition mean that you have set what some people have called certain quotas for reporters, that those who get more hits on a story that they've done on the website might be rewarded financially, better assignments?
No. We have reporters who write 4 or 5 stories a year, and they tend to be big, truly important, groundbreaking investigative stories. and we have people who write 400 stories a year. Obviously, most people fall somewhere in between. There is a sort of general question of productivity. If somebody is not covering their assignment as aggressively as they should be, and they're getting beaten, then that's a black mark against them. But no, we have not. We don't measure the hits to their website and pay or promote them accordingly.
Dean, you've been editor-in-chief of a major newspaper, now Washington bureau chief of another major newspaper. You've been around journalism a while now. Your colleague Jim Roberts, the assistant managing editor of the Times, says you all live now in a new time frame in which you work. No longer 24/7, meaning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, he says, it's 1440/7, meaning 1,440 minutes a day and then 7 days a week. That describes a totally new psychology in journalism. How do you manage that at a major newspaper?
It's tricky. I mean, it's funny. A lot of what we do today with the balancing the website and the print paper reminds me of the afternoon paper where I started in New Orleans, where it was remarkably similar. When you came in the morning, you had to come up with a way to move the ball for the afternoon editions in covering a story from the morning paper. So there's a similarity. It's tricky to manage. It requires a lot more decision-making, faster off-the-mark decision-making. I mean, I said that you asked earlier how I describe, what do I see my role at the front page meeting? I said I see my role as sort of picking the 2 or 3 gigantic, most important stories of the day. I think that shifts constantly through the day. You have to work harder to manage, for instance, a White House reporter's time. A White House reporter now, in the pre-web era, a White House reporter could go to a press conference at 10:30 and go to lunch after. And now the expectation is no lunch.
No lunch.
But now the reasonable expectation is that we have to figure out a way to file a story for the web shortly after the press conference, assuming it's an important enough press conference. And then we have to start thinking about what are we going to provide the reader for the print paper, and maybe even the reader for later in the day. So it's trickier.
One of the things in my mind is when Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was shot, the Times reported on its website that she was killed. You reported that not because you had somebody in Tucson who fed you that information. You reported that because CNN and NPR had said she was killed. In other words, you used other news organizations as your sources. Now, I checked this. You did say, news organizations say that she was killed. Technically, that's an accurate statement, but it was dead wrong. So how do you avoid, in the future, how do you avoid, Bill, that kind of blunder?
Well, there's no such thing as an okay mistake, whether it's, and especially when it's one of that magnitude. Even the fact that it was on the website for 7 minutes, before it got corrected, does not justify getting that sort of thing wrong. The way you protect it is a number of ways. First of all, you send a clear message to reporters that it's nice to get it first, but it's most important to get it right.
But these were the editors who made that call, not the reporter.
It was essentially a rewrite man who
made
it, and it slipped past an editor. The second thing you do is you have not just one usually, but at least a couple of editors who look at the story before it goes up on the website and whose job is to challenge material that isn't supported. And the third thing you do, I think, is you teach people that it's okay to be explicit in the story about what you don't know. And all these are things we try to do. I make no excuses for that particular blunder, and several people got a finger wagging over that. But the fact is, it doesn't happen all that often. Mm-hmm. And it's just kind of miraculous when you think about it. I mean, when people say, how do you put out a daily newspaper with all of the authority and so on of the New York Times and still keep up with this daily news report where things are happening all the time? And my answer is, almost every day we do it.
Is the editing process for the newspaper the same as the editing process for the web story?
Yes and no. I mean, it's the same. No, it's the standards are the same, and in most cases, it goes through the same layers of editing, but it does it at an accelerated pace. So it's very much like the editing that a story gets on a tight deadline. And even before the internet, you always had these occasions. A story that broke, 30 minutes before deadline, did not get the same editorial attention as the story that broke in the morning. It just didn't.
Let me take a minute now just to remind our radio, television, and website audiences that they're watching or listening to the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and my guests are Bill Keller and Dean Baquet of the New York Times. On the Times, you have news, and then you've got opinion. Now, there should be a wall between the two. Your ombudsman, Arthur Brisbane, says, and I quote, "The news pages are laced with analytical and opinion pieces that work against the premise that the news is just the news," unquote. Many conservatives, as you well know, criticize the Times as being a liberal left-wing newspaper, and that those views get into the news part of your newspaper. Why do you allow this to happen?
We don't allow it to happen.
But it happens.
But
it happens almost every day.
According to Art Brisbane, or according to you?
No, well, according to people who have read the New York Times for many, many years.
Yeah.
There's more, what I'm getting at here, Bill, is that there is more analysis dipping into commentary and the editorial side of reporting than a straight hard news story.
I don't mind analysis in the news pages. In fact, I encourage it every day. I think the discipline of objectivity or impartiality is something that is drilled into American reporters from their first day on the job. It's different from a lot of other countries where the press is encouraged to be partisan. You declare your biases up front, and then people can judge it accordingly. It's an aspiration, and reporters and editors bring their own beliefs to their jobs, and they are expected, just as judges are supposed to set their personal prejudices aside in judging a case, reporters and editors are expected to lay their personal prejudices aside in assessing the facts of a news story.
Don't you believe that there is more opinion, commentary, analysis today in the paper, however you choose to define it, than there was 10 years ago? And if the answer is yes, tell me why.
Yes, I think there's a lot more analysis, because I think that's what readers want and expect of the people who've actually been out and witnessed events and gathered the information. The reporters who cover
Bill, aren't you making that assumption that's what they want? How do you know that? Maybe what they want is just a straight news story and not your opinion.
Maybe, and we give them a lot of that too. But they don't get my opinion. But if if we're going to write a piece on a particular political figure, then supplying some context to his remarks or his activities is a service to readers, I think. I don't think any reporter is justified in saying Congressman X is wrong, or he's a fool, or he's unqualified, but you're certainly justified and expected to say, here's where these views of his come from, here's what his constituency is, here's who he listens to, here's what he's said in the past. That's analysis, and I think it supplies the context without which the bare facts are not of much use to readers.
Okay. There's always been a certain amount of opinion. I mean, I think there is a fine line, a thick line, rather, between opinion and analysis. But there's always been a certain amount of opinion in newspapers. Book reviews are opinion. Theater critics, offer their opinions.
Yeah, but Dean, that's different. That's different from covering the White House and offering.
But I guess what I'm going to argue is that you're not going to, as the person in charge of covering the White House, you will see, I would argue, cogent analysis coming from the White House. You will see an attempt, it's an imperfect creature, a newspaper is, I think that there is an expectation today that the audience does not want us to any longer say, if Barack Obama gives a speech at a certain time of day, that Barack Obama said X yesterday. I think there's an expectation, and I'm going to make the case, again, that newspapers may have failed in not doing that 25 years ago. There's an expectation that the writer puts some of that in some context. There's an expectation that the writer reminds people that, it's a president who is, forced to make a certain kind of comment on a foreign policy issue because his last foreign policy issues were struggles or whatever. I think
Absolutely.
But I think that's, if you find us crossing a line farther than that in the coverage of that speech, then I would say that's a mistake. But I don't think that's the common occurrence Art or others might say it is.
But you are both acknowledging that there is more analysis
Yes.
in the paper today, because your judgment is that the reader wants that rather than a recitation of the straight story. They want an analysis you're saying they want your analysis of what the president meant. It reminds me during the Vietnam War, there used to be 5 o'clock follies in Saigon, where the reporters were told by the colonel what it is that happened that day when the reporter was there watching it, that day. Doesn't need the analysis of the colonel to tell him. And I'm only raising the question, but you've already answered it in a way, that maybe what people want is less of the analysis, unless maybe you've done studies on this and you've concluded.
Just to add one thing that I think I may have stressed too much. When I say it's the reader's expectation, I guess I'm not saying that there's a readership survey and that the New York Times and other American newspapers are sort of hewing to the dictates of a readership survey. I'm saying that the overall mission of a newspaper actually has changed hardly at all. The overall mission, which is to explain the most important events, to describe, explain, and lay out the most important events of the day before, or in the Jim Roberts recitation, the hour before. I think the way of doing that has had to change, but it's always had to change. I mean, it was different 60 years ago.
Of course.
So I would argue that's not based on readership surveys. That's based on, if you have a core mission that you're responsible for, it stands to reason that you're going to have to change in the way you deliver it over time.
Absolutely. Let's talk for a little bit about this new thing called a paywall. I'm led to believe that allows me to gain access to your website if I pay for that access. I'd like to project, say, a year or so into the future. What is that paywall going to look like? As best you can estimate now.
Well, there are many different varieties in this species of paid online news. The one that we are adopting a little later this year is what we call a metered model. That means you get a certain amount for free, and beyond that point, you're expected to subscribe. The most visitors, casual visitors to the website, will never encounter that little billboard that says, we would like you to subscribe. The people who are home subscribers to the print paper won't encounter it either. They continue to get it for free. What we're saying is that people who use the New York Times website as their newspaper, as something they come back to it over and over, they spend a lot of time reading it, they treasure it, should pay a little something for it. We don't want to scare away droves of readers, and we're actually prepared to, make adjustments along the way so that we don't lose a lot of the traffic to our website, which advertisers particularly like and pay a tidy sum for.
But if I have a subscription to the New York Times, which I do, and I then have access to your website.
Yes.
So as you look into the future, that kind of a business model will continue.
I believe so.
Yeah. And so you're dealing mostly, when we talk about this paywall, what is on the web. And I'm wondering whether, as you make your calculations now between the printed newspaper and the web, what is more important to you? how many people show up in both worlds? Do more people read the paper than read the web?
They're different questions. The printed newspaper still supplies the overwhelming majority of the revenues that keep the company going, but many more people come to us on the website than come to us in print. There are, roughly speaking, 1 million subscriptions to the printed newspaper each day. We get, by some estimates, as many as 50 million people who come each month. It's not quite an apples-to-apples comparison, but those are the metrics that the web provides. We have the numbers vary. There's a Nielsen rating. There are a couple of other ratings, but the round number is something like 50 million people worldwide. Unique individuals come to the New York Times website every month.
Do you, Bill,
and that number is growing.
I'm sorry?
And that number is growing, whereas the print circulation, of course, is not.
Do you have a separate staff for the newspaper and a separate staff for the website?
Not anymore, or almost not anymore. When the website started out, it was a little kind of rump operation. It was even in a separate building. About 5 or 6 years ago, we decided that that was a big mistake, that you didn't want to have this, treat the website like an afterthought. You were cheating people who came to the newspaper online of the kind of creative energy of this experienced news staff. And so we've been gradually remaking it into a single newsroom, and it's pretty much there.
I got an old-fashioned question, which always bugs me. The reporter today working for the Times or CBS or the Post works very hard, in a way much harder than we did 20, 30, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. And that is because that reporter has to service so much. It's the paper and it's the website, and you find them on radio and television, and it's a big deal. Mm-hmm. When does a reporter have a chance just to think rather than produce? Is there a moment to reflect on what it is that is going on in the world?
That's a really good question, and it's one that's dogged, I think, all news organizations as we've moved into this digital realm. You don't want to turn them into sort of hamsters on wheels who are constantly producing updates. We've done a number of things. We created a kind of rewrite bank that will, so you have to leave a certain amount of discretion in the hands of the reporter. So if the reporter says, I need more time to report, I need more time to think about this, you can provide it. And we do that. We will assign the sort of web version of the story to somebody else, to a bank of rewrite people, or to another reporter.
You don't get a demerit for that, do you?
No, you don't get a demerit for that. I mean, it is true that people have adapted. I mean, reporters don't like to let go of their story to somebody else, and so more and more of them have come to think of filing for the web as simply sort of filing their first draft, and then they continue to revise over the course of the day. And at the end of the day, they have, the story about as good as it's going to get.
But Bill, is the reporter's first responsibility when he or she comes upon a fact or an insight to provide it to the web?
If they can do that quickly in a way that we can get it up on the website, and then we can liberate them to go do additional reporting, to dig down, add some dimensions and some analysis to the piece, then yes. But we try to keep the lever in the hands as much as possible of the reporter, because it really is, I mean, we're not a wire service. I mean, I love wire services, but the wire service, the premium is on speed. I think people come to the New York Times for a kind of authority because they trust us to get it right and to explain it in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah, but I have a feeling that you are operating, forgive me, despite what you just said, you're operating in a world that lives by speed, by, this 1440/7. Mm-hmm. Now, that's different from 24/7. The psychology is different.
That's true.
You're asked to do something for the web. The minute you have something, put it on the web. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if you're going to write something decent, you want to sit down and talk to somebody and then write it. Mm-hmm. That takes time.
That's true.
All right, so what's the responsibility of the journalist now? To deal just with the web at that point? Does he alert Dean in Washington, if you have a Washington reporter doing this, and say, hey, I got something really good, but I've got to write it first for the web, and you allow him to do that?
Sure. I mean, we should differentiate between the way you described it, the sort of factoid. The truth is, I don't think people come to the New York Times for the factoid. We're not talking about the big, gigantic running story of the day where the factoid is something large. If a reporter wandered into my office with a story about an unimportant appointment, and I had to balance that against a more important story, I'm going to say don't push and I think Bill would agree, don't put the unimportant factoid on the web. But if you're talking about, I'll give you, a classic example, a reporter who knows he is competing against the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or somebody else on a story, who is ready to write the story at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I want that story up at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's a judgment we make all the time.
Okay. Let's talk about the WikiLeaks phenomenon for a bit. WikiLeaks, as we know, the leaking of secret government cables, many of them embarrassing, harmful to the United States. The Times has published many stories based on these cables. Bill, you've written eloquently about it and defending the Times decision. There are a couple of questions that flow through my mind. Is WikiLeaks, which seems to have a very specific anti-American flavor or impulse, is WikiLeaks a legitimate source for the New York Times?
Well, WikiLeaks is a source.
It is a source.
And, sources tend to come with agendas. They come with biases. Sometimes they come with distasteful biases. It is true that WikiLeaks has a kind of, to the extent that you can define an ideology, it's sort of a little anarchistic. It's anti-institutions, anti-important, governments, anti the United States. But every source comes to you with some kind of agenda. What you have to do is focus on the information that you get. Is the information true? Is it valid? Is it newsworthy? And in our relationship with WikiLeaks, we said at the outset, and we knew at the outset a fair amount about this organization and their biases and their agenda. And we made it very clear that we were going to treat them as a source and nothing more than that. That is, we will take their information that they offer us, we will vet it, we will supply context, we will censor it, which we did. We edited out any material that we had reason to believe could put lives at risk. We did not consult WikiLeaks on what we would write about or what we would write about any given subject.
Do you believe, Bill, that WikiLeaks is a legitimate news organization, deserving of the First Amendment privileges that the New York Times enjoys?
Well, those are two questions. As to, one is
answer
what
them both.
I will more or less answer them both, in part because I'm not a lawyer. I think somebody who has a job like mine should be a little humble about deciding who gets to call themselves a journalist or who doesn't. WikiLeaks is not in my ballpark of journalism. They do not practice the kind of journalism that we practice at the New York Times or at most serious news organizations. They're an advocacy group, or you can call them a vigilante group, or whatever. The question of whether they're entitled to First Amendment protections, though, is a somewhat different question, because the First Amendment protections are not only afforded to the press. It's a very tricky question for lawyers to parse, and I am not a lawyer. What's the difference between somebody who takes a lot of raw material and publishes it on a website and somebody like us who vets it, massages it, shapes it into stories and publishes it in a newspaper?
But in a way, Bill, the New York Times became the enabler of WikiLeaks by publishing a lot of stories based on the cables that WikiLeaks provided. And when I use the word enabler, I'm not using that in a positive way. as I think you know.
And I think it's the wrong word. I think WikiLeaks and its leaders were entirely capable of publishing the material on their own. And it would have
WikiLeaks would have published it on its own?
Absolutely. They would have published it to a website available to anybody who wanted to look at it.
I know, but
the information would have circulated through the blogosphere in a day, and people would have been cherry-picking out the information that was most interesting to them, using it in, I imagine, some interesting ways and some alarming ways, but it would be published. The difference between Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, and WikiLeaks is that Daniel Ellsberg really needed something like the New York Times, unless he wanted to spend the rest of his life in a Xerox machine.
Yeah, but bear in mind that Daniel Ellsberg took the Pentagon Papers and went first to Congress to try to get legal action against the war.
Right.
He went then to Harvard University, I don't know why.
Sure,
to
but
try
the
to get
fact is,
something.
And in the end, in order to get it out,
he went to the Times.
He needed the New York Times.
Exactly, and
did not
WikiLeaks
need
needed the Times also.
No, it didn't.
You didn't?
No. I mean, we certainly gave a lot more attention and currency, along with the other news organizations that published and wrote about it,
think about
than
it,
they would have gotten
Bill.
on their own. But I think it also came out in a much more publicly valuable way
There's
than
no
if it had just
question
been
about it.
posted on a website.
Not arguing that point at all. I totally agree with you on that. The question I'm getting at is this. If the New York Times had not published all of those stories, and it had been left to The Guardian in England and a couple other newspapers around the world, it would have been reported in the United States on page 16 of the Times,
Oh,
the
no.
AP.
Oh, you're so wrong.
Wrong.
You're so wrong. It would have been on the front page. The day after The Guardian published its stories, versions of The Guardian story would have been on the front page of every newspaper in
Do you
America.
believe
And
that
it would
there was
have
so
been on
many-
CNN and everywhere
Did you
else.
believe that you broke many news stories?
Well,
Do you believe
yes,
that
yeah.
WikiLeaks gave you one new thing that you didn't know about Afghanistan?
Yes, actually.
Like what?
I thought I learned a lot from those reports. I mean, the fact, I realize one of the criticisms that's been launched at these WikiLeaks documents is, well, they didn't tell us anything profoundly new about the world. Most news does not tell you something profoundly new about the world. News moves in inches and feet. It moves in increments. WikiLeaks told us, for example, that the people who are running the war in Afghanistan have grave misgivings about the role that Pakistan plays, our important ally in the region.
I could point to 20 stories in the New York Times
Right.
that said the same thing.
And not one of them was based on the
They were
dispatches from
based
people
on
in the
very
field.
good digging, talking to secretaries of state and defense and all that. All of the guys working for Dean in Washington knew that and reported that.
Except, here's where I think you're wrong. First, I actually think this is, I know this doesn't go over big in Washington, is sort of an unimportant argument. I mean, I think the debate over whether or not WikiLeaks had a dramatic new factoid, if by that you mean the dramatic new factoid that said, a head of state took a bribe and you didn't know about it, I think that's sort of an odd argument. There is no question, as somebody who has edited and been involved in a bunch of the stories before WikiLeaks about Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, there is no question that WikiLeaks added tremendously to the understanding anybody who cares about those wars in the world have about those wars in the world. It's one thing to have sort of second, third-hand reporting that says the rulers of countries in the same region as Iran, who are afraid to say it publicly, are very nervous about the rise of Iran and Iran's nuclear capability. It's another thing to have it in the words of the diplomats who are talking to those people. So I would argue that those were rich documents. But what I would flip back is, put aside the debate over what WikiLeaks provided. Isn't it unimaginable to anybody that the New York Times would have had the arrogance to have this stuff and not publish it? To me, whenever the question's been raised, to me, was the New York Times behaving in an arrogant way or sort of, flaunting its ability to publish this stuff, enabling WikiLeaks, working with WikiLeaks or whatever. To me, the most unimaginable arrogant thing the New York Times could have done was to have this stuff, look at it, say, this is interesting, let's have an ethical debate, let's put it back in the computer and let's go have lunch.
You
That to me would be shocking.
You misread me.
Okay.
You
Well,
misread
no,
me.
I'm not misreading you. I
My-
think I'm using this as an opportunity to address.
I know you're getting
to
back.
address other people.
No, I do understand what you're doing. But please understand that the thrust of my questions is based on a profound respect
No, I
for the New
understand.
York Times.
I understand. But
And
it's
the
an
position of the New York
Sure.
Times in American journalism and global journalism.
Right.
So that when Bill Keller makes a decision,
Right.
he's making a decision not just for the Times. You're making a decision for American journalism, too. Now, that puts you in a very special position. And I think we've done that subject. I don't want to move on. Rupert Murdoch.
Who?
He's a guy in the WikiLeaks document.
Oh, yeah.
Is he
Little
good-
guy.
Oh, yeah,
Is he
right.
good for journalism?
Well, he's spending a lot of money employing journalists. So
Oh, that's a good thing.
in that respect, particularly the way the market for journalists has been over the last few years, I have to applaud that. And I think he loves news of a particular kind. I'll
Of a particular
including. Well, I mean, as he has often said, his personal taste is more for the sort of New York Post tabloid kind of journalism. But he's bought a wide range of journalism, has invested in a wide range of journalism, and I think that's a good thing. I think his most lasting effect in this country is Fox News.
And what is the effect of Fox
I
News
think
on American journalism?
I think the effect of Fox News on American public life has been to create a level of cynicism about the news in general. I think it has contributed to the sense that they're all just out there with a political agenda. Whether it's Fox is just more overt about it, and I think that's unhealthy. I think Fox has also raised the. I mean, we've had a lot of talk since the Gabby Giffords attempted murder about civility in our national discourse, and I make no connection between the guy who shot those people in Tucson and the national discourse. But it is true that the national discourse is more polarized and strident than it has been in the past, and to some extent, I would lay that at the feet of Rupert Murdoch, yes.
Quick question. You said of Bob Woodward of the Washington Post that he wrote, quote, all but authorized accounts of the innermost deliberations of our government, unquote. If the Times had a chance to hire Bob Woodward, would it?
In a heartbeat, of course. The point of that remark was...
We would have ended it.
Yeah. No. I have enormous admiration for Bob Woodward and what he's done, and I've read an awful lot of Bob Woodward. The point of that remark was that in Washington, officials complain about secrets when they don't like them, but they collaborate in the dissemination of secrets when they think it will serve their purpose. And of course, people talk to Bob Woodward because they think it's a way of furthering their agenda.
We've got about a minute and a half left. So the question goes to Bill. There are a lot of journalism students out here. Would you encourage them to plunge into it despite all of its problems or go to law school?
Well, you just made the choice real easy. With all due respect for the legal profession, of course I would encourage them to go into it. I think, first of all, there are a number of places that are hiring again, not for large sums of money, but then most of us didn't start out getting large sums of money in this business either. And what I generally tell aspiring journalists is, let's say the worst case scenario happens and news organizations dissolve and it all becomes a kind of free-for-all. Nobody's paying money for people to be reporters. If you can master the skills that you're supposed to master, gathering information, vetting it, sorting it out, making sense of it, writing it, presenting it in a way that's accessible and even engaging, then you can find work in a lot of fields. There are a lot of fields from the law to academia to science where those skills will serve you extremely well.
Well, and Dean, do you buy into that?
Oh, sure. Sure.
You would tell these kids to go ahead and do it?
I would say too. I would even say that with the arrival and the rise of the web, it's probably more of a blast now for kids going into journalism than it would have been 10 years ago.
Well, that's fantastic. Our time's up, I hate to tell you. And I want to thank first our wonderful audience. I want to thank, too, our radio, television, and internet audiences all over the country and, for that matter, all over the world. But most of all, I want to thank our two guests, Bill Keller and Dean Baquet, two remarkable reporters representing the New York Times. Thank you for being with us. And to all of you out there, all of you who cherish a free press in a free society, I'm Marvin Kalb, and I like to use Ed Murrow's last line, good night and good luck.